Hi YouTube, I am giving a video now to you, especially for those who find themselves in situations feeling like, oh, there's nothing I can do, I'm a horrible person, because when I talk about racism or homophobia, you feel like you are part of the group that is the problem and there's nothing you can do about it. Well, fortunately, there's plenty you can do about it, and so this is a video for you. I am going to be referring to the work that an essay that comes out of this book, The Feminist Philosophy Reader, edited by Allison Bailey and Chris Cuomo, and in particular, an essay by Allison Bailey entitled Locating Traitorous Identities Toward a View of Privilege-Cognizant White Character. Allison Bailey is talking about traitorous identities when it comes to white anti-racist identities, so we'll be using her example in terms of how to address racism if you're a white person. But this traitorous identity can apply to lots of different categories or social identities that one might have, because we can think about a traitorous identity as being a reference to those who belong to dominant groups, yet resist the usual assumptions and orientations of those groups. So a traitorous identity could be one that is straight, but becomes a gay ally. You could be men, but you can become a feminist man. And we also can talk about dominant groups in terms of class, culture, religion, ability, and other things. I mean, there's plenty of them. So the task is how to formulate ways to articulate and embody these dominant group identities in new ways that don't depend on the subordination of marginalized people to re-establish and reaffirm that dominance. Okay, so if we really want equality, we have to figure out new ways to understand our identities. This means that, importantly, identity isn't just a reference to one's innate biological born features. For instance, like white skin. You can be white based on the color of your skin, but a white identity, and this I'll say with Charles Mills, a capital W white identity, is something that is embodied so much more through things like actions, gestures, assumptions, biases, presumptions, reactions to other people or situations, and all of these actions or gestures or behaviors or habits comply with expected scripts of what it means to be a white person in a racist society. Marilyn Frye is someone who refers to this as whiteliness, and like I said, Charles Mills makes the difference between white with a capital W, which has so much to do with how you perceive and understand the world and how you act in it, as opposed to a small case W, which is more to your phenotypical characteristics like the color of your skin. Okay, so if we understand actions and embodied behaviors or habits as constituting so much of one's identity and how one fits into a dominant group identity or not, then we can think about this in terms of often unconscious habits, not just explicit conscious things like going around saying you hate people of color or going and violently attacking homosexual people. That would indicate that you're probably of a dominant group, and you have some things to work on. But so many people say, I'm not a racist, or I'm for gay rights, and actually unintentionally or perhaps unknowingly reiterate the same sort of scripts that promote privilege for some and disadvantage for others. And that's the stuff that we're talking about here. So we want to draw attention to those behaviors. The way that Allison Bailey talks about it is in terms of scripts that are expected behaviors that only reiterate and reinscribe unjust hierarchies. So Allison Bailey gives the example on page 350 of the book that I showed you earlier. She says, the majority of whitely scripts include things like being nervous around people of color, avoiding eye contact with them, or adopting closed, uncomfortable postures in their presence. You can also think about these whitely scripts in terms of how one might adjust their way of interacting with someone if they talk to them differently, if they change the language that they use, especially by like talking down to another person, or if they just happen to prefer certain locations or events or places or, whatever, cultural items like movies or music. And question in terms of also where people feel most comfortable. Okay. Now, Allison Bailey addresses this privilege identity, or the privileged identity, as some people want to evade it. that means not acknowledge it or dismiss it, or even become defensive and say, oh, I'm not privileged, I have worked really hard for this, and so anybody could work just as hard and get to where I'm at. It has nothing to do with race or gender or sexuality, etc. But by evading privilege, Alison Bailey is saying that people are not challenging others to think about privilege, and thereby, for lots of reasons, probably because they also act in terms of those scripts, they also reproduce that privilege through their actions. This can be seen in examples where people say, oh, I'm not racist, I don't see color, I just see people. The reason why that's problematic is because it completely eliminates the differences that are important and salient for our experiences. Like, if you're white, you walk around the world with privilege. People will treat you like a white person. Another way of looking about this is by people saying, oh, feminism, that's not necessary anymore. We had the 60s, and look at how much women have gained in equal rights. Okay, no, that's not true, because we still have an important need for feminism. There's a really wonderful video, a documentary that's coming out, and it's starting to get some recognition. Misrepresentation, I think I'll put a link down in the description box just so you can see. There's plenty of work for feminists to do. So to say, oh, women have equal rights is to completely ignore the fact that there is not equality for women. Okay. If you recognize the problems with those sort of statements and you want to become a traitor who works for greater justice and equality, then a traitorous identity, Alison Bailey says, becomes privilege-cognizant, which means that you cognize, you become aware, recognize, and give attention to how one's privilege works and operates and where it comes from. This involves also listening to other people's perspectives and their understandings of the workings of social realities, and actually being like open to thinking that they might see something that you don't usually see. It's also, I like to think of it as really emphasizing this notion of choice. But that's, Alison Bailey says this much. Again, on page 350, she says, a key feature of privilege-cognizant standpoints is the choice to develop a critically reflective consciousness. Traders choose to understand the price at which privileges are gained. They are critical of the unearned privileges granted to them by white patriarchal cultures, and then they take responsibility for them. So I really appreciate that she emphasizes how to become a trader involves a choice, and beyond that, an ownership of one's responsibility to do something about it. So even though Alison Bailey talks about traitorous identities as being privilege-cognizant, I like to think about it as privilege-cognizant plus, because it involves actions. It involves changing your behaviors, which requires so much legwork, first to become conscious of what you do and how you do it, and paying attention to these little tiny subtle things that happen throughout the day. But it also requires dedication and time, because this is a process so much that you have to develop a new habit, a new kind of character. And that takes a whole lot of work. All right. What this basically amounts to become a traitorous character, to develop new habits, being privilege cognizant plus, it amounts to being really PC. Not in an annoying way, but in a way that actually draws attention to how privilege works. It involves probably becoming uncomfortable, not becoming defensive, eating some serious humble pie, and questioning critically your own position in society. Some examples, I think it's important to give examples of how to challenge certain scripts of male privilege, white privilege, heterosexual privilege, etc., and to see how so much of this functions through our daily life. So let's see, for sexuality, instead of assuming that when someone says they're in a relationship or if they have a wedding ring on, that they're heterosexual, maybe assume that people are queer, or you don't have to, but note when you think that people are just straight. A lot of people aren't. And furthermore, even if you see a heterosexual couple, a guy and a girl together, maybe they're not heterosexual. Maybe one or both of them identifies as being queer or bi in some way, right? Interesting. But if we assume a lot of things, like assuming that if someone's not white that they're an immigrant, or assuming if someone is not speaking English that they're dumb, that is a problem. Another way is to challenge the assumptions that, people of color are lazy, or if someone's unemployed, it's because they're a welfare addict, or it's because they're not educated. Not always the case. And this means that we can do things like challenge gender scripts, like not reinforcing expectations for girls to look a certain way and only giving them recognition and credit for being super, super pretty by saying pretty girls can't be smart. You know, it's ridiculous the way that this happens. But even scripts of like, why do women take the man's name in marriage? I don't know. It's a history. There's some things that we just don't think about anymore. There's lots of little tiny behaviors that we have throughout our personal daily lives, but also in the way that we are supposed to behave. The expected things of us in so many different social arrangements that all need to be called into question. One thing that's really easy is by looking at language that we use. So calling people out on their shit is important work. Again, you might seem really annoying and PC, but it's for good reason. So when people say things like no homo, or hey fag, or don't be a pussy, or you're a cocksucker, man up and grow some balls, all of those phrases are reiterating a certain image of masculinity that is derogatory insofar as it feminizes the person to whom the insult is targeted. All of that plays into pictures of gender, pictures of heterosexuality too, in a problematic way that a lot of people can be unconscious of. And even if you draw their attention to it, they may say, oh, that's not how I mean it, but they say it, and it has an effect. And that's the point. We need to be able to isolate those particular moments and do something different. Okay, now, last, I have to pay attention and make sure that this is really appreciated. That there's a difference or a fine line between walking into a space like saying, oh, you need to learn about other people's cultures or other people's experiences. So that doesn't mean go sit with the black kids at the lunch table. That doesn't mean start barging into other religious ceremonies. And it doesn't mean a lot of things like, I don't know, just interrupting a gay pride event or something like that, or going up and speaking at a rally. Because some of those things are protected spaces for good reason, because people need their own spaces too. And to think that one could just walk into another person's whole thing and be accepted and welcomed is probably a mark of privilege already. An arrogant sense of privilege. So again, eat your humble pie and don't just say that, you can go in to learn about other people, because most importantly, you probably could start by learning about your own self. Reflect on your own history. See what has happened to get you to where you are, to uncover the assumptions about what it means to be white, male, Christian, heterosexual, upper class, to get an education. Think about how these privileges have been seated. And finally, this all means that if you want to be a straight ally, if you want to be a male feminist, if you want to be a white anti-racist, awesome. We need you and your support. But that is so much more than just saying you're for equal rights. You can't just say it. You have to know what you're saying. You have to be able to articulate a position. You have to be able to understand yourself and others' experiences better. So it's not just a matter of saying, sure, I'm for equal rights. You have to do things for it. That's why it comes down to recreating your habits through your actions. Okay? Good luck.